Portland Intown Contra Dance, we are so committed to facing and challenging racism in the contra dance community. And during this hour, Kafari and Jake are going to talk about cultural appropriation. They're going to talk about it within the context of our American folkways. They're going to talk about it within the context of their personal journeys, as well as their journeys as musicians. And they're going to talk about decolonization. They might also play some tunes. So those are all things that you can expect during this time. For us, as a majority white community, facilitating really candid and constructive reflection on the position and privilege of white people and whiteness and how it functions is a core anti-racist action that we want to be continually engaging in. We know that as we inquire, this might mean that as white people, we might feel some things come up in our bodies. We might notice that we have some resistance or some other feelings that occur. And my invitation to you, our invitation to you, is to drop shame because it only gets in the way, and instead get curious and genuinely inquire. One of the most formative, I guess, educators for us are our bodies and the way that things show up in our bodies. And racism shows up in our bodies a lot. So pay attention to that, and it could be a good teacher for us. So constantly dismantling racist structures and replacing them with healthy anti-racist counter-narratives is critical to changing systems and to changing racist behaviors. And most of those behaviors are habitually hidden from white view. So one of the things that we're up to this evening is illumination. Institutionalized racism and structural inequality pervade and shape our American folkways and our American systems. So understanding the living tradition we participate in more deeply requires holding and sitting with multiple complex stories of oppression and broadening our view to include what has been carefully omitted, like violence that has shaped and continues to shape our world. As we inquire into the tradition, we uncover the Black authorship of fundamental and emblematic modern music and dance practices that we still engage in. We uncover that our roots are in the structures of slavery, of minstrelsy, and other oppressive systems, and we acknowledge that that history has a shape in our present. It shows up today. So in contra dance and other American folkways, we uphold white supremacy when we continue to consume this Black culture while remaining complicit in the story of its erasure. And we also uphold white supremacy when we only engage at the surface, when we speak from a white-centered exploitative perspective. The work of inquiring, uncovering, and including our history allows us to be genuine, to genuinely engage. We must follow the lead of Black musicians, of artists, of practitioners, of scholars, of all of those incredible leaders who have contributed to and continue to contribute to these living folkways and to anti-racism work. As we go tonight, we encourage you to add your thoughts and questions to the chat box. In alignment with our no jerks policy at PICD, know that we won't tolerate any jerks. So if you're a jerk, we're gonna kick you out, just like we do in the dance hall. So we are so grateful for you in joining us in this exploration, in starting with us from the point of inquiry, of curiosity, of genuineness. So now that we have that out of the way, I'll introduce our speakers. So we are joined by Kafari, and he's a Portlander, a pianist, a beatmaker, a bluegrass percussionist, and he specializes in the rhythm bones. He became inspired to play the bones after seeing a concert that debunked his assumptions about bluegrass and exposed him to the African-American roots of traditional bluegrass and old-time music. He's been in Portland since 2011, and Kafari has been a friend of so many cultural organizations in the city of Portland, bringing his unique perspective as an artist mentor, teaching the bones to students all over Maine and also to people within our city. And he's also really well known as an improvisationist, creating these dreamy, wonderful compositions of jazz, electronic music, ambient music, and hip hop that take loops from old jazz recordings. And we'll share a link to Kafari's music so that you could get a sense of his full repertoire after this is over. We're also joined by Jake Hoffman, and Jake is a multi-instrumentalist and a singer. Jake used to live in Portland, but he just left us for Oakland, California. And he most recently worked at 317 Main, and that's 317 Main Community Music Center up in Yarmouth. And he was a teaching artist and a program manager. Now living in Oakland, he is a teacher and an outreach director at Blue Bear School of Music. And he has toured 20 states, 11 countries. He performs and teaches ballads, gospel, and dance music from Appalachia and the American South. Jake and Kafari have been collaborating within this world of cultural appropriation, really featuring it as a part of the education that they do at their concerts. And we are so incredibly excited to host this as a discussion where we can have the intention and the space to talk about this together. So Kafari and Jake, thank you so much for your ongoing labor, for your willingness to be teachers, and we welcome you with whole hearts. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Real quick, just wanted to say that my pronouns are he, him, and Jake.
Hey, everybody. Della, thank you for that wonderful introduction. We're really excited to be welcomed into this conversation, especially with a lot of other folk practitioners. Kafari and I have been talking about how we've talked about cultural appropriation with a lot of students, but not necessarily in a group of folk musicians and dancers. So we really appreciate this opportunity. We're really excited to have some dialogue. And my pronouns are he, him.
And we just really wanted to thank all the work that your community has been doing. And you know, this conversation about cultural appropriation is such an extension, I think, of the conversations that you've all been having. And I haven't been to any of your events yet, but I certainly look forward to coming to one, you know, once it's safe to come out again. We wanted to just quickly share just some ground rules around our conversation today. And we just wanted to say that with this time that we have today, we really want to focus on our discussion of cultural appropriation from the perspective of agreeing that it exists. You know, we don't want to spend any time, you know, debating whether or not it's a real phenomenon. We think it's beautiful that everyone has come here with the intention to learn more about this, and we thank everyone for coming and for wanting to come correct to this space. You know, we all have work to do in coming correct, right? So we just wanted to acknowledge that we are not pioneers in this work around cultural appropriation. There's an entire community of people that have been doing this work, and Black and Indigenous people have been doing the bulk around dealing with extraction and appropriation from their cultures. And Della, you were saying that I got into this through the Carolina Chocolate Drops, and the Carolina Chocolate Drops really were the band that showed me that Black folks are not merely on the fringes of old time music, as I once thought. You know, growing up in Cincinnati, you know, in a predominantly Black neighborhood, I had this image of old time music that didn't involve Black people. So when I was actually able to see that Black people are at the center of that, it was an extremely liberating moment for me that resulted in me learning about Blackface and learning about my own history. And to be honest, it was incredibly healing for me. So all the time, I try to tell Black folks, you know, do you know that the banjo is an African instrument? You know, do you know that Black people are all around old time music? And it's healing work to be sharing that history. Jake, how did you come to find this work important?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many people, like you said, who have already been doing this work. I want to mention some of them. The Carolina Chocolate Drops came together at the 2005 Black Banjo Gathering. And that all happened because a Black banjo player in Florida started a Yahoo group. And it's just funny how folkways happen in this modern era, where it was an online discussion group that turned into humans coming together and reclaiming history. And the Carolina Chocolate Drops have disbanded by this point, but Rhiannon Giddens, Dom Flemons, Layla McCalla, Hubby Jenkins are still making amazing music and carrying the torch for both Black string band music, but also education around cultural appropriation. Some other folks that I want to mention are Jerron Paxton. Sometimes he goes by Blind Boy Paxton. He's a multi-instrumentalist, amazing teacher, the best banjo teacher I've ever heard. And then somebody in New England, he just moved up to New England. His name is also Jake Blunt. He played at Blue last year, and Kafari and I were able to see him. He's in Providence now, and he just put out a record. His last name is Blount. The way I got into this, I mean, really, as a student, it was my first semester at college. I think we were reading Orientalism by Edward Said. And I was learning a lot about colonizers, my ancestors being colonizers, appropriators, oppressors. But then when I took this learning and sort of looked at myself, I realized I was also a colonizer. I am an appropriator, an oppressor, not just in my actions, but like just in the way I think, in my learned bias from how I grew up. And I knew this is something that I had to work on dismantling, and I'm nowhere free of it at this point, but it's work that needs to continue. Around this time, I started playing banjo, which I knew as a white instrument primarily growing up. I went to a Tony Trischka concert where he went through the history of the banjo, and I started to learn a little bit more. And to my surprise, it was an African-American instrument that enslaved people created in different places in the Caribbean and Southeast United States. And so I've had to look at myself in a different way. What does it mean for me to play the banjo? What does it mean for a Black person to play the banjo? Also at this time, first semester in college was a big deal because I also learned about blackface minstrelsy at that point and couldn't believe that I didn't know about it beforehand. Why was this history swept under the rug? Maybe in some cartoons, I had seen some images of, entertainers dressed up in a certain way that maybe I'd seen in some iconography on advertisements or something like that. But the fact that it was the most popular form of American entertainment, and really what brought American entertainment and music to the international stage, was white people directly appropriating Black music, but then also making up their own music and selling it as Blackness. And so we see that through minstrelsy, and we see that through today as well. White people trying to define what Blackness is for their own safety and to uphold white supremacy. That was a little bit of how I got into thinking about these things. But when Kafari and I started playing together, we couldn't help but talk about this stuff all the time. We talked a lot more than we played music. We were talking about the history, and when we were playing for other people, it was sort of disingenuous to not bring all our whole selves and all of our thoughts to what we were presenting. yes, it might sound like a nice, happy, snappy banjo tune, but we wanted to be honest with our audiences, and we're grateful to have had the opportunity to do that in different settings.
And like Della put it so amazingly before, when we fail to share the history of this music, it colludes in the violence against Black folks who've had their stories erased. So it's been a very eye-opening experience to try to have these conversations in public. But what we wanted to do today, just to give everyone a rundown of our framework today before our Q&A, we wanted to, first of all, define what is cultural appropriation, so that maybe we can learn to identify it a little bit better. Secondly, we're going to examine how it takes place specifically within old-time music. Third, we're going to talk about strategies of countering cultural appropriation. So we're going to get right into what it is right now. So the roots of cultural appropriation come from a 500-year legacy of colonization that has lent itself to racism and capitalism. And it's important to realize that we're living in a world after 500 years of colonization. So when we start to talk about what it means to decolonize, we're talking about unlearning 500 years of programming. And that's the amount of time that Indigenous folks have been dealing with settlers being here on this land. So we can see how colonization has led to capitalism as an extraction of resources from certain folks to the benefit of other folks. And a great place to begin, a very basic place to begin thinking about cultural appropriation is just the land and the crops commandeered from Native people and the labor exploited from Black slaves. But things of cultural value as well can be appropriated and extracted from marginalized cultures, and oftentimes by a dominant white culture. And cultural appropriation at its most basic is taking a symbol or a practice out of its original context and plugging it down somewhere else where it has a different meaning. It's oftentimes devoid of its original meaning. And the people who are doing the extracting are usually benefiting, whether through personal gain, financial gain, or entertainment. It's often done without permission. And for this reason, cultural appropriation carries connotations of exploitation and dominance, because a marginalized community cannot do anything to stop the appropriating from happening. So one of the most common examples of appropriation, separate from music, just take cornrows, for example, which is a really common hairstyle in the Black community, or braids, people often call it. So Black folks have been discriminated against. We've lost jobs. We've been kicked out of school for having braids, for having cornrows. But white fashion models, on the other hand, have been praised as edgy or classy for wearing cornrows. So on one hand, you have Black folks being penalized by institutions, but on the other hand, you have white folks being praised. And that's where we sort of get into the dilemma here, which is that you have violence happening to one group of people, but then it's being praised in a separate group. It's important to note that appropriation can also be a tool of political and cultural repair. And the act of cultural transport itself is not an ethical dilemma. And the bones actually are a really good example of this, because Black slaves, they saw European white folks playing this really basic instrument, the rhythm bones. By the way, these are the bones right here, by the way. I don't know, hope they didn't kill anyone's eardrums just there, because they're really loud. But the bones are a really great example of appropriation happening without violence. Black slaves saw white folks playing the bones, and they decided to take that on because the resources were available. They're a very low cost instrument. The first bones are made of rib bones from an animal. And that's how they gained entrance into Black culture. But then when you have the instruments of blackface minstrelsy and the entire industry that emerged around blackface minstrelsy, of appropriating Black culture, and also not just appropriating it, but presenting it in an incredibly demeaning light. You know, all the ugly stereotypes of Black folks were present in blackface minstrelsy. And in so many people profiting from that industry, you know, music schools, instrument makers, venue owners, individual musicians, all the advertisements that were part of what you would receive during a blackface minstrel show. An entire industry was created around appropriation. So it's important for us to really think about power when we're identifying cultural appropriation. It becomes violent when the powerful appropriate from the marginalized. But there are forms of appropriation that are not powerful. I mean, all the time we appropriate words from our best friends, you know, and we can't go through life without taking things from other places, you know, and incorporating them into how we live. So important things for us to think about when trying to identify appropriation are power, profits, and it comes from a power structure. So because of the way American society is so hierarchicized, I don't know if that's a word, it lends itself to so much violence and appropriation from that point. Jake, do you have anything else to share about that, or would you like to move forward to how appropriation plays out within old time music?
I would just say, I think everything you covered was really spot on. And yeah, the banjo, on the other hand, we see the other side, as opposed to African Americans picking up a white instrument of the bones. In minstrelsy, we see white people playing the banjo for the first time. And they're the first people making money from it as well. So you're right, it is totally a power structure. And then there's the evolution of the banjo, where it starts off as a pretty simple instrument, no frets or anything. It didn't look like a guitar in its beginnings. But then after 40 years of the minstrel show, bringing the banjo to white households and white venues, white theaters, there were white banjo makers who were saying that, oh, in our hands, the banjo has now been lifted up to a higher level, and it's been improved. Yeah, I think it's just the whole history of the banjo is a history of cultural appropriation. Absolutely.
And just before you get into that next section, I just wanted to also share that, you know, oftentimes what happens with appropriation is a white norm becomes established, so that, you know, when we're in these old time spaces, we don't think to ourselves, we're all the Black folks. We don't instinctively ask that, because the norm is no longer includes Black people. A good experiment to do, just go to Google, type in banjo player, and just note how many images are of Black banjo players. That can tell you a lot about imagery, and what we imagine these spaces to be, I think, is a very important part of liberating these spaces, so that they include all kinds of people.
Sure, I'll go ahead into how cultural appropriation shows up in old time, if that sounds like a good time, Kafari.
Sounds great.
Yeah. So, it being that most of y'all are in Maine, I wanted to talk a little bit about Melly Dunham. He was a fiddler and a snowshoe maker from Norway, Maine, born in 1853. He started fiddling in his teen years and was known to play area dances. And by the 1920s, in the age of jazz. Melly was in his early 70s, still playing, and he was invited to Michigan by Henry Ford of Ford Auto Company to perform at his dances at his home in Dearborn, Michigan. Melly was a huge hit in Michigan, not just for his playing, but also his personality, and he became a star, an icon of old-timey music. He was celebrated across the country. In Boston, he was given the key to the city. Newspapers kept tab on his whereabouts. And yeah, he became popular in the vaudeville circuit. He even recorded a few traditional tunes and his own compositions for Victor Records. So, but how did an old fiddler from Central Maine become such a big deal? Because Henry Ford, one of the richest men in America, gave him prominence. Now, Henry Ford, in addition to being a business owner, was openly anti-Semitic. And his investments in old-time music were in direct response to the growing popularity of jazz, a Black art, which Ford saw as popularized and distributed by Jews. And he didn't want any of it. So he was investing in teaching square dance in schools to counter the popularity of dancing to jazz. And he invited some of the best fiddlers in the country to his dances to be celebrated, Melly being the most popular of all. This was also the first years of recording, and many of these fiddlers got recording contracts out of this. And while Henry Ford was lifting up old-time music, giving it national prominence, do you think he was including any Black fiddlers in his invitation list? Or maybe some extraordinary fiddlers who had recently immigrated to the States from Eastern Europe? No. So at a time when jazz, modern Black music was changing how people thought and moved, when Black artists were innovating, pushing boundaries, expressing themselves publicly, growing national and international respect for Black culture, Henry Ford was helping shape old-time music as a purely white Anglo kind of folk art. There were plenty of Black fiddlers and Black string bands at the time, but Ford was depicting old-time fiddle music as having nothing to do with Black music or Black culture, neither in its history nor at the contemporary time of its folk life. So as we celebrate a Maine fiddler like Melly Dunham, who has some of the oldest Maine fiddle tunes recorded, and his unique rise to national fame, we see that his gains in popularity and wealth were inextricably tied to the erasure of Black artists and African-American folkways. And we can see this story as just history, just a product of the times. Hey, it was 1920s. Black people were being lynched. Black people were being kept away from the ballot box. Jim Crow and segregation were alive and well. So this story of whitewashing old-time fiddle music sounds right in line with that time of history. But are Black people not being lynched today? Are Black people finding it easy to vote today? Do we not live in segregated towns and neighborhoods where Black people have lesser education and economic opportunities? So how different was a 1920s contra dance from a contra dance today in 2020? Aren't we proud that folks have been contra dancing in Maine for hundreds of years, finding joy generation after generation, gathering hands to fiddle music? Well, we need to see ourselves in this history of whitewashing and how our contemporary folkways rely on cultural appropriation and erasure. And this will only change if we change. And I'm not saying we need to stop dancing, but I am saying that we, folk practitioners who know the healing power of folk arts, need to practice new traditions, reshape and develop new folkways that will fight for Black liberation and our collective liberation. Sorry, Kafari, go ahead.
Yes, yes. And this seems like a great time to talk about an amazing resource that Jake and I have been talking about. It's called The Processes of Colonization, and it is an essay by, I hope not to butcher this name, Poka Lenui, who wrote this essay in 2006 that expounded upon the teachings of Virgilio Enriquez. And I wanted to go through them one by one. The first process of colonization is denial. And it's a denial of where a cultural practice comes from. You know, no acknowledgement of its history, refusing that it comes from a history and a lineage. So piggybacking on the banjo being seen as an instrument that was made by white people, or you know, yoga being seen as something new age, when really yoga has been around for thousands of years. So there's a denial that it comes from a lineage. The second is destruction. And that can either be the destruction of the traditional ways it was practiced, shared, or taught, and a destruction of the connection between people and culture. And the word that I find meaningful is severance, because, and I can speak firsthand to the severance between people and culture as someone who came to old time thinking that Black people were on the margins of that experience. So third is eradication. Eradication of the history and the violence associated with it. Eradication of people as well. Eradication of people who don't fit a white standard. They're erased from the picture, you know, so that when Jake and I are playing in Vermont and I'm getting on stage with my bones, an older white gentleman says to me, "A Black man playing bones," and exclaims, and this feeling of that I actually don't belong here, and this messaging, this coded messaging that I don't belong in this space. 4 is surface accommodation. So you might see 1 or 2 Black bands playing at a bluegrass festival, but is that actually an intervention, you know, in a systemically racist society, you know? And that ties into number 5, which is tokenism. And without in-depth relationship building or honoring of all the work that a Black person had to do to be in this space, it can seem tokenistic to make them a cultural ambassador at your music school, when like really everyone's job is to be a cultural ambassador and to be doing this work of educating themselves and sharing and starting these conversations. So
an example, yeah, of tokenism that I've been reading about, many people know John Lomax and Alan Lomax as important in 20th century folk song collection. And John Lomax met Huddie Ledbetter, also known as Leadbelly, African-American guitarist and singer and songwriter, at Angola prison. He met him in Louisiana in the 30s. And Lomax was going to prisons hoping to find Black people who hadn't been influenced by popular music of the day because they were isolated and because they sang work songs that accompanied their hard labor. And if that doesn't already lay out the imbalance of the relationship, I don't know what does. But after Leadbelly's release, Lomax had Leadbelly perform around the country. But when he had him, when he was presenting him and his concerts, he made Leadbelly wear jail stripes costume instead of Leadbelly's preferred suit and tie. So they soon had a falling out, but Leadbelly, you know, went on to record Rock Island Line, Midnight Special, and Goodnight Irene, all of which were, you know, in a few more years recorded by Pete Seeger and the Weavers, and that really spurred the folk revival of the 1950s and 60s. Yeah, Leadbelly does not get that credit, but you know, he was that one African American on the scene in the 30s and 40s, but obviously the power was not in his hands; it was in the white presenter's hands.
So what are strategies that we can use to counter cultural appropriation? There's so much that we can do. Hopefully we've given you some ideas that can help you identify it when it's in front of your face. But now we want to talk about what we can actually do to address it. So the first thing that I think about is it's just a question that I pose to everyone here, and that's, how do you know that an old time space is anti-racist? When a Black person enters an old time space, in Maine or anywhere else, what are the signs that can allow that Black person to feel like they're safe, that they won't experience harm? You know, I just think that's important to think about, and there are things that we can do, even something as small as wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt. Of course, it's a very surface level display of activism, but it is an intervention from the norm. And that's a question that I pose in the most open-ended way to everyone here, to just simply think about how old time space looks to a Black person standing on the outside trying to make a decision to enter or not.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a great question. I mean, you have to think about who's building the platform for presenting folk music or folk art, and what if a Black person feels uncomfortable with that platform, or they need to alter their appearance, their sound, their actions to fit within the standards of the white audience. What we hear, what we see, is that really folk music? Is that really folk culture at that point? And is that really inclusivity?
Humbleness and humility are great strategies for addressing cultural appropriation. Acknowledging what we do and don't know about the practice, acknowledging where it comes from, acknowledging the aspects that we are sharing and what we might not be sharing. We don't have to know everything. We don't have to know the whole story, but to simply be humble about what we do know, what we are sharing can be very powerful, and can create an atmosphere of curiosity, so that we're digging deeper into the history, and together we're trying to uncover this history that collectively has not been spoken about.
Yeah, I see more and more folks in the old time community referring to where they got their tunes, digging into the history of the tunes. Whereas, I think of a lot of the music from the 1960s folk revival that I grew up listening to. Artists were sometimes ripping off melodies, entire songs, and not crediting them. So really doing the research, yeah, and like you're saying, Kafari, you don't need to explain the entire history, but if you're not expressing a power imbalance, if there is one there, you are just helping continue the silencing of certain artists.
Pay Black artists. This is an important one, and it's give Black artists the means to continue to be able to create this music, and to do what they're doing. There has been a historical exploitation, and even though we can't go back in history to correct it, we can do something for those Black artists working in old time, working in all sorts of different genres where appropriation is a reality. We have the ability to make a change right now.
In Oakland, there's the Black Banjo Reclamation Project, and I met some of the founders at an old time festival here, and their goal is to reclaim the banjo and put it in the hands of folks of the African diaspora. And if people want to donate to that fund, I'm happy to share that link later.
Mm-hmm. So the next one is acknowledging where songs and instruments come from. And this is a great thing that you can do at your show. And it can be an awesome way to infuse a little bit of history into your set. I also think that sometimes we uplift appropriation without knowing it, you know, and we have to think about what spaces are we putting energy into, you know, what musicians are we supporting. You might try to have a conversation with a musician who you think might be neglecting certain important components of the history throughout their performance. And it's important to realize that Black folks have been saying this a lot, but we need white folks. We need white folks to be having these conversations amongst each other, because Black folks can't be louder than we've been already. And it's 7:42, so maybe we can both share one more, Jake, before we dive into Q&A. Does that sound okay?
Yeah. What you were just getting to was a thought that I was having, is that, yeah, it's not up to Black people to make white people respect Black music. That is not Black people's job. We see Black people doing a lot of the work right now, a lot of the emotional labor, not just around this, but for basic civil rights. And we need to show up.
The last piece that I have is just to practice consent in your conversations about race with Black people. And this goes beyond simply old time and American folkways. But if you are curious about the perspective of a Black person with respect to cultural appropriation, try to be sensitive to the fact that it can be a hard conversation for Black folks to have. It can be a draining conversation. It can be a contentious conversation. I've had many conversations where I felt like I was vying for my own humanity, and I left feeling drained, where maybe the other person felt like they had learned a lot, but I felt like something was taken away from me in the process. So acknowledging that there are lots of resources for us to learn about cultural appropriation, and to actually sit down and to hear from a Black person, we want to make sure that we are valuing their time and their energy. And a question as simple as, do you have the space and the energy to talk about this, actually can be incredibly respectful, to acknowledge that the conversation is not a light, fluffy, generative conversation all the time. That's all I got, Jake.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, should we open it up for questions?
Sounds great.
Well, okay, so I've just been unmuted. I have a comment here from someone in the audience, and certainly if you've been listening and you have a question or a comment to add now, feel free to send it in the chat box and we'll start reading those. But someone said, too many songs are attributed to traditional when they actually have a composer. And so that comment of doing the research. So I wonder, as musicians, as artists who are doing this work and who are creating a repertoire for yourselves, how do you select a repertoire and how do you do research to really understand where your music is coming from?
That's a great question. The answers aren't always there, which is difficult, but come on, we're in the age of the internet, people. Yeah. There's lots of, especially for fiddle tunes, Tune Archive is a great place, and it gives a lot of the history behind it. But, you know, this sort of has to do with the history of folk scholarship in America, where, you know, when it was really blossoming in the late 19th century, early 20th century, folk scholars were they were really looking at a lot of like Anglo ballads, and folk scholars were only finding exactly what they were looking for. And there's a lot of folk music and original music that we don't know the authorship. Where do you go? Where do you go? I mean, I've learned so much from liner notes. I've learned a ton from Smithsonian Folkways is an amazing label. And I'm happy to give book recommendations and to share some internet resources where I've found a lot of great information.
Become a historian. Essentially, you know, I think that oftentimes we say, okay, and you have an artist, and then you have a historian, and you have an activist over here, but these are all the same thing, and we're called in the year 2020 to be all these things if we're going to create spaces that are just, if we're going to play shows that everyone can see themselves and their tradition respected. And
thank you. I wonder, staying on this topic of music, we have a question about the songs that are very common within, you know, old time, within contra dance, within our folkways, that are deeply ingrained in culture, and they come from minstrelsy. So the question is, you know, should these songs be avoided? Should these songs be placed in context?
I think context is everything. Absolutely. And I mean, that's a huge part of cultural appropriation, is what context are people hearing things in. And that's what, you know, has moved Kafari and I to talk about the history, because how can you leave that out? Of course, you know, there's lots of minstrel songs, yeah, that you still hear on the radio that are in like grade school songbooks printed up through the 1990s with you know, minstrel dialect and everything. I believe it's all about the context, and yes, if it's going to be shared, we need to know a little bit about minstrelsy to understand where it's coming from. Because otherwise it could be, you know, you might think that it comes from an African American tradition. And yeah, and we never get to that conversation of white supremacy, which is a great reason to play a song that comes from the minstrel catalog if we are leading to talking about privilege and supremacy.
Do you have thoughts on this, Kafari?
no thoughts.
Okay. So another question is, do you have suggestions for online music camp organizers who are wishing to bring this conversation to their events?
Was the question, do you have resources? Do we have resources?
Yeah, it's just suggestions.
Suggestions.
Yeah, so maybe some techniques for making this part of the overall conversation during an online music camp. I feel like you've set out some suggestions for practices of decolonization as we go. I wonder if you have suggestions for creating an overall atmosphere where this is a present conversation.
Mm-hmm. 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 Oh man, there's so many places where you could begin. I mean, even just to talk about race in America, I think could be a great place to begin. But to create a curriculum around it, I've got no suggestions right now. Yeah, especially for an online music camp. Jake, do you have anything?
I mean, online anything is difficult because you know, a lot of these are real human issues, and it's nice to be in the same room to talk about this kind of thing. And of course, we're doing it here now, so it is possible. But yeah, I think creating space that's not just, you know, if you're doing an online music camp, you can't just talk about this for the first half hour or hour. It needs to be ongoing. And you need to create space for that throughout as people encounter new ideas and new questions along the way, because that's how we experience these things as we digest them.
I couldn't agree more. I think we should be constantly interrogating race. throughout all the different ways that we're relating to this music. So it's not like you have your Black History Month where, you know, 1 month of the year you're engaged in learning about this history, but it's part and parcel of everything you do, you know, examining tunes and creating space and being sensitive to who's in the room. It just becomes ingrained, and we are all called to deepen in our as anti-racist accomplices who don't simply say Black Lives Matter and then call it done, but prove through our actions that Black Lives Matter and create game plans to show that. So thank you for asking that question.
So to continue along that train of thought, you know, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about as a contra dance organizer, as a caller, as a dancer, is the pervasive whiteness of our spaces. And other organizers have been having these conversations, and it seems like often people will jump right to, oh, well, we need diversity. And it reminds me of reading Angela Davis, and she said, quote, "I have a hard time accepting diversity as a synonym for justice. Diversity is a corporate strategy. Diversity without structural transformation simply brings those who were previously excluded into a system just as racist, just as misogynist as it was before." So as we're thinking about transformative change within our folk cultures, particularly in dance spaces where this conversation might never have happened before, uh, what what suggestions do you have for white accomplices in starting just those first steps of transforming culture or starting the conversation?
I think investigating whiteness is a good place to start before figuring out how to diversify a community. And if you're looking for diversity and inclusion, on whose terms? On the pre-existing community, or on a more diverse community's terms? Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and you know, just simply having people of different skin colors in a room can't necessarily be the answer, because what are the experiences of those people? Do they continue to feel like outsiders in that space? So thinking about, like, you know, the question I was posing before, you know, what are the ways that we are able to recognize an anti-racist old time space with how it's set up? I think that we have to think that those things through, and you know, there have been a lot of Black activists in the old time world who've been speaking very eloquently on this, and we have to amplify those voices, you know, and because the message has been out.
Absolutely. I'll add that in my experience, and maybe you have something to add on to this, but in my experience as an organizer, I think that it's a failure in organizing when we try and go out and say all are welcome, and then we just try to harvest people. And particularly people who don't look like us. That in itself is a white supremacist act. That's disingenuine. And so creating awareness of our own, speaking as a white person, creating awareness of our own bias as a white person, particularly as a white organizer within the space, and then noticing the barriers that I have created and other white people have created to that genuine feeling of allyship, to that genuine feeling of having an anti-racist community, is the place to start. Inquire into the barriers that you yourself have set up that's creating a hostile space for others to be a part of. Do you have anything to add or counter there?
Okay. I think again to be aware all the time that the norm is whiteness, and that if you are able to attract Black folks to the space, they might not think that they're part of old time music. So to be constantly sharing the history, to debunk this idea that whiteness is the norm of old time music, I think is a crucial part of that as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. I know that there's quite a few comments here asking for recommendations for the books and resources that Jake and Kafari have mentioned, and know that we'll collect all of those links and suggestions and put them all out there. So if you go back to the event space tomorrow, or you check out our Facebook group or the Facebook event, you'll see all of those links out there, and we'll share those things. Let's see. So I'm looking for other questions. We probably have time for about one more question.
We have tons.
Yeah, and we have tons of questions. So I want to get to one that is actually similar. Or is, let's see. So this question could be for Jake. I wonder, and Kafari, if you have something to add here, it would be really critical. But you know, as a white person talking to other whites, Jake, about decolonization and the work that you're doing, how do you counter resistance? How do you educate others? Is there advice for allies?
It's a good question. I mean, for me, that conversation like starts with me talking to myself, and my need for perfection, and my desire for comfort, and noticing these qualities as parts of my whiteness, seeing inside myself, recognizing white saviorism inside myself, white fragility, and it sort of starts with those, for me at least, and I'm a big introvert, so I do a lot of reading and thinking on my own before I'm talking to other folks. But I think the biggest part is that we're gonna mess up. You are gonna mess up. I am gonna mess up. And that's the only way forward. And I think in white culture, in Maine culture, confrontation is a really scary thing. And we need to figure out how to dismantle that idea, and to talk to each other, and really, yeah, talk real talk. And, you know, I only lived in Maine for 10 years, so I'm not calling myself a Mainer, but yeah, I definitely have a little bit of experience of hearing the hard conversations get swept under the rug. So, you know, start with yourself, move to your closer friends, but you also need to be ready to reconsider relationships in this time. The relationships that we've had, we can see the system that we're living in right now, and that needs a change. So maybe our small systemic changes can be part of that.
And really approaching, I'll add, really approaching this in sustainable ways, because racism is a white person's issue. This is,
exactly.
You know, this is a white person's issue. You know, we have created and generated so much harm. So starting inside is a really powerful way to start. Thank you, Jake. Kafari, I wonder, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, and to add to everything that you both just said, to see our growth as anti-racist advocates running parallel to our growth on our instrument. You know, any technical or creative growth that you have on your instrument, try to match that with your growth and learning about race and learning about gender, and being a better space holder, that when you're on stage, you are able to protect people from different forms of violence that can exist in the audience. But I think oftentimes when we think about growing as a musician, it's from a more of a technical or creative standpoint, but that's not the only way that we can grow. We have to grow in so many ways, and they all run parallel to each other. So that's my my parting words for everyone, and we thank you for holding this space with us. This has been so good for my heart, and thank you for showing up so engaged. And thank you, Della. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Dugan. It's been wonderful.
Gosh, thank you both so much for engaging in this conversation and doing so from such a personal and vulnerable and generous place. You both have put so much work into your perspective, your experience, and your own development as human beings. And we are so lucky that you are spending this time with us and that you are laboring on behalf of the entire folk community. Thank you. This has been incredible. And we look forward to hosting more conversations like this with the two of you as partners so that we can continue to uncover those things that are hidden and create more genuine relationship within our folk community and undo the structural racism that's inherent in the system. So thank you. All of the resources that Jake and Kafari have referenced will be included in the links, as I said, and our apologies that we didn't get to everyone's questions. We wish that we had more time, and maybe next time we'll schedule this as a longer conversation. If you are interested in having more conversations, Portland Intown Contra Dance is hosting a monthly reading group that is focused on anti-racist topics, and that's happening on a monthly basis. And so you could sign up for July. And the first book that we're reading is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And then we will be reading more books on a monthly basis and debriefing in Zoom calls like this. So you could sign up on our website if you're interested. Are there any other resources you two want to throw out there, Jake or Kafari? No? Okay. Anything, Jake?
No, I'll share things in the links that you send out tomorrow.
That sounds wonderful. And the final thing to know is that we value each and every one of you for spending your time with us this evening. It is incredible to see all of your faces. We miss you so much. And it's just really cool to spend this time with you, and particularly spend this time with you delving into a topic that is so critical for the health of this tradition that we love, that's a living tradition, and also for our health as human beings, as we know and recognize that we belong to one another and that we're cultivating belonging with one another. So thank you so much for your time.